It started with 3 words shouted across a moonlit parking lot: a woman fighting for her life, and a single father who couldn't walk away from danger. Ulrich Van Rohe thought he was just stopping for gas on his way home from his night shift at the steel mill. Instead, he found himself face to face with 3 kidnappers dragging a woman toward a black van outside the Pinebrook gas station. "Don't move," he commanded, and everything changed. He thought it was just another moment of doing what was right. She knew it was the moment that would expose billion-dollar secrets, test the limits of trust, and bring a fleet of helicopters to the quiet streets of Millstone Valley by dawn. What neither of them expected was that saving a stranger's life would lead to saving an entire community, uncovering a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power, and discovering that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest act of courage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The neon sign of Pinebrook gas station flickered against the October sky, casting an unsteady red glow across the empty parking lot. Ulrich Van Rohe pulled his battered Ford pickup truck next to Pump 3, the engine giving its familiar wheeze before falling silent. He checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. His shift at Thornfield Steel Mill had run late again, thanks to a furnace malfunction that kept the whole crew overtime. All he wanted now was to fill up, grab a coffee, and get home to Brookhaven before midnight. The station sat at the edge of Millstone Valley, where the interstate curved through the Appalachian foothills. During the day, it was busy with truckers and travelers, but at this hour, it felt like the edge of the world. Ulrich stepped out of his truck, the cool mountain air hitting his face after 12 hours of steel mill heat. His work boots crunched on the gravel as he unscrewed his gas cap, the familiar routine of a man who had made this same stop hundreds of times. That's when he heard the struggle dot at first. It was just voices carried on the wind, coming from behind the station where the dumpsters sat. But as Ulrich stood there, hand on the gas pump, the voices grew louder, more urgent. A woman's voice, sharp with fear. A man's voice, rough and commanding. Then another man, then a third. Ulrich's military training kicked in before his conscious mind caught up. 4 years in the army had taught him to read situations fast, and this one was screaming danger. He moved away from his truck, staying low, using the shadows cast by the overhead lights. As he rounded the corner of the station building, the scene came into clear, terrible focus. 3 men in dark clothing were dragging a woman toward a black van parked behind the building. She was fighting them every step of the way, her long dark hair whipping as she struggled. One man had her arms pinned behind her back. Another gripped her legs. The third was trying to wrestle a piece of duct tape over her mouth. "Stop fighting, princess," the largest one growled. "This'll go easier if you cooperate." The woman's response was to drive her elbow into his ribs with surprising force. He doubled over, cursing, but his grip didn't loosen. The van's sliding doors stood open, waiting. Once they got her inside, she'd disappear forever. Ulrich didn't hesitate. He'd seen enough evil in Afghanistan to recognize it instantly, and he'd learned that good men who did nothing were just as guilty as the ones who did wrong. He stepped out of the shadows, his voice cutting through the night air like a blade. "Don't move." The 3 men froze. The woman stopped struggling and looked toward him, hope flashing in her eyes. Ulrich could see her face now, illuminated by the security light mounted on the building's back wall. She was young, maybe early 30s, with intelligent eyes and expensive clothes that were now torn and dirty from the struggle. "Walk away, old man," the largest kidnapper said, straightening up. He was built like a linebacker, with neck tattoos and hands the size of dinner plates. "This ain't your business." "Lady doesn't seem to agree with you," Ulrich replied, his voice steady. He was outnumbered 3-1, but he'd faced worse odds in Kandahar province. "Let her go," the second man, wiry with nervous energy, laughed. "You got a death wish or something? There's 3 of us and 1 of you. Auric took a step closer, his movements deliberate and calm. Years of steel mill work had kept him strong, and years of combat had taught him that confidence was half the battle. Math was never my best subject. The largest man released the woman and reached into his jacket. Auric saw the glint of metal and knife, maybe a gun. Time slowed to that crystalline clarity he remembered from firefights overseas. The world narrowed to essential information, threats, distances, angles of attack. Your choice. Friend, the man said, his hand still inside his jacket. Auric smiled. The kind of cold smile that had made Taliban fighters think twice about engaging his unit. No, it's yours. The big man's hand came out fast, but Auric was already moving. He'd closed the distance before the knife fully cleared its concealment, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection and sending them both crashing into the side of the van. The knife clattered away across the asphalt. The wiry one came at him next, swinging wild punches that Auric deflected with movements drilled into muscle memory. A quick jab to the solar plexus dropped the attacker to his knees, gasping for breath. The third man, shorter and stockier, grabbed a tire iron from inside the van and rushed forward. Auric sidestepped the swing, caught the man's wrist, and twisted until the tire iron fell free. A knee to the ribs sent the third attacker stumbling backward into the dumpster with a metallic crash that echoed across the empty lot. The big man was getting back to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where he'd hit the van. But instead of continuing the fight, he looked at his two companions, one still struggling to breathe. The other slumped against the dumpster and made the smart choice. This ain't over, he snarled at Auric, then jerked his head toward his men. Move it, now. They scrambled toward the van, helping each other up. The engine roared to life and they peeled out of the parking lot, leaving rubber on the asphalt as they disappeared into the night. Auric memorized the license plate as best he could in the dim light. Though he suspected it was stolen anyway, the woman stood frozen against the station wall, staring at him. Now that the adrenaline was fading, Auric could see she was shaking. Her blouse was torn at the shoulder, and there was a bruise forming on her left cheek. But her eyes were clear and alert, watching him with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. You all right? He asked, keeping his distance. He knew that after trauma, some people needed space. She nodded, then seemed to realize she should say something. Thank you. Her voice was cultured, with the kind of accent that spoke of good schools and better neighborhoods. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't. Don't worry about it, Auric said. He pulled out his phone. We need to call the police. No, the word came out sharp and fast, surprising them both. She looked embarrassed by her own reaction. I mean, yes, of course we should. But maybe we could go somewhere safe first? I don't think they've gone far. Auric studied her face. She was scared, that was obvious, but there was something else there too. Something that made him think there was more to this situation than a random kidnapping attempt. My truck's right out front, he said. I can take you to the police station in Millstone Valley. It's only about 10 minutes down the mountain. She nodded gratefully. That would be perfect. As they walked back around the building toward his truck, Auric found himself stealing glances at her. Even disheveled and frightened, there was something striking about her, not just her beauty, but the way she carried herself. Like someone accustomed to being in control, now suddenly vulnerable. I'm Auric, by the way, he said as he opened the passenger door for her. Auric Van Roe, Vazira, she replied, settling into the worn bench seat. Vazira Halcourt. The name didn't ring any bells for him, but something in the way she said it, like she expected it might, made him file it away for later consideration. He started the engine and pulled out of the gas station, checking his mirrors carefully to make sure the black van wasn't following Dot as they drove. Down the winding mountain road toward town, Vazira finally stopped shaking. She was quiet for most of the drive, staring out at the dark forest rushing past. But as the lights of Millstone Valley came into view below them, she spoke again. You didn't hesitate back there. Most people would have called for help and stayed hidden, or glanced at her. I've seen what happens when good people do nothing. Military? Army. 4 tours. She nodded as if that explained everything, which maybe it did. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what had just happened and what came next. Neither of them had any idea that by morning, everything in Oryx's quiet life was about to change forever. Life was about to change forever. The Millstone Valley Police Station occupied a modest brick building on Maple Street, wedged between a hardware store and a diner that had been serving coffee and pie to locals since 1947. At nearly midnight, only 2 patrol cars sat in the small parking lot, their presence a reassurance that help was just a few steps away. Oryx parked his truck under a streetlight and walked around to open Vazira's door, a habit ingrained by his late wife Rebecca, who had always insisted that manners mattered even in the worst of times. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Inside, the station buzzed with quiet activity. Officer Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, took their statement with the thoroughness of someone who had seen enough violence to take every report seriously. She photographed Vazira's bruises, collected Oryx's description of the attackers, and put out a bolo alert for the black van, though all 3 of them knew the kidnappers were probably across state lines by now. You should go to the hospital, Officer Santos told Vazira, noting the bruise on her cheek and the torn clothing. Get checked out properly. Vazira shook her head. I'm fine, really. Just shaken up. Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? Santos asked. Family in the area? A hotel? For the first time since the attack, Vazira looked uncertain. She glanced at Oryx, then back at the officer. I was staying at the Grandview Inn up on Route 19, but if those men know where I was, I don't think I should go back there. Santos frowned. The Grandview's been closed for renovations for 3 months. Where exactly were you staying? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Vazira's cheeks flushed slightly, as if she'd been caught in a lie she hadn't meant to tell. I misspoke. I meant the Pine Lodge, the one near the interstate. Officer Santos nodded, though something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. I can have an officer escort you there, if you'd like. That won't be necessary, Vazira said quickly. I'll be fine. Oryx had been quiet during most of the interview, but something about the exchange bothered him. The Pine Lodge was a truck stop motel, the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour as much as by the night. It didn't match Vazira's expensive clothes or cultured accent. And why had she mentioned the Grandview first? As they finished up at the station, Officer Santos handed each of them her card. Call me if you remember anything else about those men, or if you see that van again. And Ms. Halcourt, please do reconsider the hospital. Outside in the parking lot, Vazira stood beside Oryx's truck, looking lost. The bravado she'd shown inside the station seemed to evaporate in the cool night air. For the first time, she looked as vulnerable as she must have felt. You don't really want to go to that motel, Oryx said gently. It wasn't a question. Vazira sighed. No, I don't, but I don't have many options at midnight in a town I don't know. You could come to my place, Oryx offered, then quickly clarified when he saw her expression. I've got a guest room. My daughter Emma stays with me every other week, so it's set up proper. You'd be safe, and we could sort out better accommodations in the morning. Vazira studied his face in the dim streetlight. You don't know anything about me. I could be dangerous. Oryx almost smiled at that. Lady, I just watched you fight off 3 kidnappers while wearing heels. If you were dangerous, I think I'd have figured it out by now. Something in his tone made her relax slightly. Emma, that's your daughter? 12 years old, going on 25. She's with her aunt this week, but she'll be back on Saturday. He opened the truck door for her. My place isn't fancy, but it's safe. And I make decent coffee. The drive to Oryx's house took them through the older part of Millstone Valley, where Victorian houses sat on tree-lined streets and porch lights created pools of warm yellow light. His home was a modest two-story craftsman with a wraparound porch and a front yard that showed the careful attention of someone who took pride in maintaining what he had. Even in the dark, Vazira could see flower boxes under the windows and a vegetable garden along the side yard. "It's beautiful," she said as they walked up the front steps. "Rebecca's design," Oryx said, unlocking the front door. "My late wife. She had a gift for making things feel like home." The interior lived up to the promise of the exterior. The living room was furnished with comfortable, well-maintained pieces that spoke of a family life built around warmth rather than showiness. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with a mixture of technical manuals, classic novels, and what looked like Emma's school reading assignments. Family photos covered the mantel above a stone fireplace, showing happy moments from a life that had clearly been rich in love, if not in money. "Sit," Oryx said, gesturing toward the couch. "I'll get you something to drink. Coffee, tea? Something stronger?" "Tea would be wonderful," Vazira said, settling into the corner of the couch. She pulled a throw blanket around her shoulders, handmade, she noticed, probably by Rebecca, and felt some of the tension leave her body for the first time in hours. While Oryx moved around the kitchen, she studied the photos more closely. Rebecca had been beautiful in the way that came from inner contentment rather than perfect features. Emma was a younger version of her mother, with the same warm smile and intelligent eyes. But it was the photos of Oryx that struck her most, pictures of him in uniform, looking serious and competent, mixed with candid shots of him laughing with his family, covered in flour from some long-ago baking project, or reading to a much younger Emma curled up in his lap. "She died 2 years ago," Oryx said, returning with 2 mugs of tea. He'd noticed her looking at the photos. "Cancer. Fought it for 18 months before it finally won." "I'm sorry," Vazira said, accepting the mug gratefully. The tea was Earl Grey, perfectly steeped. "She looks like she was a wonderful person." She was. Oryx settled into the armchair across from her, close enough for conversation, but far enough to give her space. "Best person I ever knew." She could make anyone feel welcome in 10 minutes. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the events of the evening. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed once, marking the half-hour. Outside, the night sounds of suburbia provided a peaceful backdrop, a dog barking in the distance, the whisper of wind through leaves, the occasional car passing on the street. "Can I ask you something?" Vazira said finally. "Why did you help me? I mean, really. You could have been killed." Oryx considered the question seriously. "I guess because I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't. Rebecca used to say that we're all responsible for each other, whether we want to be or not. That ignoring someone in trouble was just another way of causing harm. That's a heavy responsibility. Maybe, but it's also what makes life worth living." He studied her face. "Can I ask you something now?" She tensed slightly but nodded. "Those men tonight, they called you princess, and they seemed to know you. Was this really a random attack?" Vazira was quiet for a long moment, staring into her tea. When she looked up, her eyes were troubled. "It's complicated. Most things worth talking about are." She seemed to wrestle with herself, then made a decision. "I'm not from around here. I was just passing through, and somehow they found me. I don't know how. It wasn't the whole truth," Oryx could see that clearly, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. She was scared of something bigger than 3 men with a van, and until she was ready to trust him with the real story, he wouldn't push. "Well, you're safe now," he said simply. "Guest rooms at the top of the stairs, first door on the right. There's towels in the bathroom across the hall, and I'll leave some of Rebecca's clothes outside the door in case you want to change. They might be a little big, but they're clean." Vazira stood, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you, Oryx. I don't know how to repay this kindness. Don't worry about repaying anything. Just get some rest. As she reached the stairs, she turned back. I meant what I said earlier. You didn't hesitate. That takes a special kind of person. No, Auric said, beginning to turn off the downstairs lights. It just takes a person who remembers that we're all in this together. Upstairs, Vazira found the guest room exactly as promised, clean, comfortable, and welcoming. The clothes Auric had left were simple but good quality. A soft cotton nightgown and a robe that smelled faintly of lavender. As she changed, she caught sight of herself in the dresser mirror. The bruise on her cheek was darkening, and her hair was still disheveled from the struggle. But her eyes, which had been wide with fear for hours, finally looked calm. She slipped between the clean sheets and closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of Auric moving around downstairs, checking locks and turning off lights. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe. Not because of bodyguards or security systems or locked gates, but because of the simple kindness of a man who had done the right thing when it mattered. What she didn't know was that by helping her, Auric had set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. And by morning, the quiet street where he'd lived peacefully for 15 years would become the center of attention for some very powerful people. But for now, in the guest room of a stranger who had become a guardian angel, Vazira Halcourt finally allowed herself to sleep. Halcourt finally allowed herself to sleep. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee drifted up the stairs like a gentle alarm clock, pulling Vazira from the deepest sleep she'd had in months. Sunlight streamed through the guest room's white curtains, casting everything in a warm, golden glow that made the events of the previous night feel almost like a bad dream. Almost. The bruise on her cheek, now a spectacular purple-blue in the morning light, served as a stark reminder that it had all been very real. She found the clothes Auric had left outside her door the night before, a pair of Rebecca's jeans, a soft blue sweater, and clean undergarments still in their packages. Everything fit reasonably well, though the jeans were a bit loose around the waist. As she dressed, she wondered about the woman who had owned these clothes. The quality was good but not expensive, chosen for comfort and durability rather than fashion. The kind of clothes worn by someone who valued substance over style. Downstairs, she found Auric at the stove, already dressed for work in his steel mill uniform, heavy work pants, steel-toed boots, and a shirt with Thornfield steel embroidered on the pocket. He looked up as she entered the kitchen, his face creasing into a genuine smile. "Morning. How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in ages," Vazira admitted, settling into one of the mismatched chairs around the kitchen table. The kitchen was clearly the heart of the home, with worn countertops that spoke of years of family meals, a refrigerator covered in what looked like Emma's school papers and artwork, and herbs growing in small pots on the windowsill. "This smells amazing, Rebecca's recipe," Auric said, sliding a plate in front of her loaded with bacon, scrambled eggs, and toast. She always said breakfast was the most important meal, not because of nutrition, but because it set the tone for everything else. Vazira took a bite and closed her eyes. The eggs were fluffy and perfectly seasoned, the bacon crisp without being overdone. "Your wife was a wise woman, she was that." Auric poured her a cup of coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since dawn. "I called Officer Santos this morning. No sign of that van, and they haven't had any reports of similar incidents in the area." Something flickered across Vazira's face, relief, maybe, or possibly disappointment. "That's good, I suppose. You suppose?" She stirred her coffee carefully, not meeting his eyes. "I just wonder if they'll try again. Any particular reason they might?" The question hung in the air between them. Vazira took another sip of coffee, clearly stalling for time. When she finally spoke, it was with the careful precision of someone choosing their words very deliberately. "Some people attract trouble without meaning to. I might be one of those people." Before Auric could pursue that cryptic statement, the kitchen phone rang. He answered on the second ring. his voice taking on the slightly formal tone people use when talking to strangers. Venro residence. A pause. No, I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong number. There's no one here by that name. Another pause, longer this time. Yes, I'm sure. Have a good day. He hung up, frowning slightly. Weird. Someone asking for a Ms. Harrington. Said they were from some kind of security company. Vazira's fork froze halfway to her mouth. For just a moment, her carefully composed expression slipped, revealing something that looked almost like panic. But she recovered quickly, setting down her fork and reaching for her coffee cup. Probably a wrong number. Like you said, probably. But Auric filed the reaction away, along with the growing collection of small inconsistencies he'd noticed since the night before. The expensive manicure on hands that bore no calluses or signs of physical work. The way she held herself, with the unconscious confidence of someone accustomed to deference. The fact that she'd given Officer Santos a fake hotel name without seeming to realize it. I should probably get going, Vazira said, glancing at the clock on the kitchen wall. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough, and I'm sure you need to get to work. Actually, I called in sick today. Figured after last night, we could both use a slower pace. Auric refilled her coffee cup without being asked. Besides, where exactly are you planning to go? You still haven't told me what you were doing in Millstone Valley in the first place. Vazira was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window at the backyard where a few late roses still bloomed despite the October chill. I was supposed to meet someone. A business associate. But they never showed up. What kind of business? Consulting work. The answer came too quickly, too smoothly rehearsed. I help companies streamline their operations. Auric nodded, though something about the explanation didn't quite add up. Millstone Valley wasn't exactly a hub of corporate activity. The biggest employer was the steel mill, and their consulting needs were generally handled by firms in Pittsburgh or Cleveland. The phone rang again. This time, Auric let the answering machine pick up. A smooth, professional voice filled the kitchen. This message is for Ms. Harrington. This is David Chun from Blackstone Security Solutions. We understand you may have been involved in an incident last evening, and we'd like to discuss your ongoing safety requirements. Please call us at your earliest convenience at... Auric hit the stop button, cutting off the message. He looked at Vazira, who had gone very pale. Ms. Harrington, I presume? She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they held a mixture of resignation and something that might have been relief. It's complicated. So you said last night. Auric sat down across from her, his expression patient but expectant. I think maybe it's time for the uncomplicated version. Vazira stood abruptly and walked to the window, wrapping her arms around herself. For several minutes, she just stood there, looking out at the ordinary suburban backyard with its vegetable garden and tree swing. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet Auric had to strain to hear her. My real name is Vazira Halcourt. And last night, those men weren't trying to kidnap me for ransom. She turned back to face him. They were trying to stop me from disappearing. Disappearing from what? From a life that stopped feeling like mine about 5 years ago. Before Auric could respond, the sound of vehicles pulling into his driveway cut through the morning quiet. Not one car, but several, their engines purring with the expensive precision of German engineering. Vazira's face went white as she looked out the front window. They found me. Auric joined her at the window. 3 black SUVs sat in his driveway, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. Men in dark suits were climbing out, their movements coordinated and professional. These weren't the same men from the gas station. These were security professionals, the kind who wore earpieces and carried themselves with the confidence that came from serious training and serious backing. Friends of yours? More like employees. Vazira's voice was flat, defeated. Or my father's employees, anyway. Your father. She nodded, not taking her eyes off the vehicles. Malvin Caraith. He owns Karaith Industries. The name hit Auric like a physical blow. Even someone who lived as far from the world of high finance as he did knew that name. Karaith Industries was one of the largest private corporations in the country, with interests in everything from defense contracting to renewable energy. Forbes had estimated Malvin Karaith's personal wealth at somewhere north of $12 billion. You're Malvin Karaith's daughter. His only heir, actually. Lucky me. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. And apparently, he's decided I've had enough freedom for one lifetime. A knock at the front door interrupted them firm. Polite, but insistent. Vasira's shoulders sagged slightly, as if some internal strength was finally giving way. I should go with them. I've caused you enough trouble already. But Auric was thinking about the phone calls, about the fear in her voice when she'd asked him not to take her to that motel, about the way she'd looked at his family photos with something that might have been longing. Most of all, he was thinking about what Rebecca would have done. Maybe, he said quietly. But maybe not yet. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Vasira looked at him with something that might have been hope beginning to kindle in her eyes. What are you thinking? Auric smiled, and for the first time since Rebecca's death, it felt like the kind of smile that could change everything. I'm thinking that if someone wants to have a conversation with a guest in my house, they can damn well have the courtesy to wait until she's ready. Outside, the men in suits were checking their watches and speaking into their earpieces. But inside the kitchen of the little craftsman house on Elm Street, something was beginning that none of them had anticipated. Something that would turn Millstone Valley upside down and change two lives forever. The knock came a third time, followed by a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to having doors opened immediately. Ms. Helcourt, this is Marcus Tharvin with Karaith Security. Your father has asked us to escort you home safely. We know you're inside. Auric looked at Vasira, whose face had taken on the resigned expression of someone who had been through this particular drama before. How many times have they done this? This is the first time I've made it 3 days, she said quietly. Usually they find me within 24 hours. Made it 3 days doing what? Trying to have a normal life, she laughed. But there was no humor in it. Trying to be someone other than Malvin Karaith's daughter, the future CEO of a company I never wanted to inherit, the poster girl for corporate responsibility who can't make a move without a security detail. The voice outside grew more insistent. Ms. Halcourt, we have authorization to enter if necessary. Please make this easy for everyone involved. Auric walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain slightly. What he saw made his jaw tighten. The men weren't just standing around waiting. They were positioning themselves strategically around his property, cutting off escape routes with military precision. One was speaking into a radio while scanning the neighborhood through what looked like binoculars. They're treating my house like a tactical situation, he said. Because to them, it is. Vasira joined him at the window. I'm worth approximately $4 billion to Karaith Industries, assuming the succession plan goes according to my father's wishes. $4 billion doesn't get to make its own decisions about where it spends the night. The casual way she said it, $4 billion, made Auric's head spin. He thought about his mortgage, about the overtime shifts he worked to make sure Emma had everything she needed, about the way he saved up for months to afford her school clothes each fall. The gap between his world and hers was so vast it might as well have been measured in light years. But then he looked at her face and saw something that money couldn't buy and security couldn't provide, the desperate longing of someone who just wanted to be seen as a person instead of an asset. What happens if you go with them? He asked. Back to the estate in Connecticut. Back to the board meetings and the charity galas and the careful choreography of a life that's been planned out for me, down to the minute. She turned away from the window. Back to being alone in a crowd of people whose salaries depend on pretending to care about me. And if you don't go, they'll wait. And eventually, they'll make the waiting someone else's problem. She looked directly at him. Your problem, specifically. I won't let that happen. Before Auric could respond, his cell phone rang. The number was local, but he didn't recognize it. He answered cautiously, Mr. Van Roe? This is Marcus Tharvin. I'm the gentleman standing in your driveway. I can see that. Good. Then you can also see that we're not going anywhere until Ms. Halcourt comes with us. This doesn't have to be difficult, but it also doesn't have to be easy. The choice is yours. There was something in the man's tone that made Auric's military training kick into high alert. It wasn't exactly a threat, but it wasn't exactly not a threat either. Let me ask you something, Marcus, Auric said, his voice taking on the steel-hard edge it had once carried when dealing with hostile forces overseas. Are you on my property with my permission? A pause. We're here on legitimate business. That wasn't the question. Are you on my property with my permission? Mr. Van Roe, I don't think you understand the situation. I understand it perfectly. You're trespassing. And in this state, I have certain rights regarding trespassers. Auric's voice never rose, but the quiet menace in it was unmistakable. So I'll ask one more time, are you on my property with my permission? Another pause, longer this time. When Tharvin spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. We're prepared to wait on the street. Much appreciated. Auric hung up and looked out the window again. The men were indeed repositioning themselves beyond his property line, though they made sure to maintain clear sight lines to all exits. It was a professional withdrawal, but a minimal one. That bought us some time, he said. But not much. What do you want to do? Vasira was staring at him with something that might have been awe. No one's ever made them back down before. Not even for a minute. Not most people. No, she said softly. You're really not. The phone in the kitchen rang again. This time, Auric let it go to the machine. The voice that filled the room was older, more cultured, and carried the unmistakable authority of serious power. Mr. Van Roe, this is Malvin Karaith. I believe you have my daughter. Even through the tinny speaker of the answering machine, the name carried weight. This was a man who owned senators and governors, the way other people own cars, who could make or break entire industries with a phone call. I want you to know that I appreciate your assistance in keeping Vasira safe last evening. However, she belongs at home, where proper security arrangements can be made. I'm prepared to compensate you generously for any inconvenience this situation may have caused. Vasira's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. He's trying to buy you off. I understand that to someone in your position. My daughter may seem like a romantic figure, the poor little rich girl trapped in a gilded cage. But Vasira has responsibilities that go far beyond her personal desires. Thousands of people depend on Karaith Industries for their livelihoods. My daughter's safety and her eventual succession to the company's leadership are not matters of personal preference. The machine beeped, indicating the message was finished, but almost immediately the phone rang again. This time, Malvin Karaith's voice was more direct. Mr. Van Roe, I've authorized Mr. Tharvin to offer you $50,000 for your assistance in this matter. That should more than cover any inconvenience or lost wages. Please consider your position carefully. Auric looked at Vasira, whose cheeks were now burning with humiliation. He thinks everyone can be bought. Can they? It was a fair question, and Auric considered it seriously. $50,000 would pay off a significant chunk of his mortgage, set up a college fund for Emma, maybe even let him take a real vacation for the first time since Rebecca's death. It was more money than he'd see in bonuses for the next 5 years. But then he thought about the way Vasira had looked when she described her life like a prisoner describing their cell, no matter how golden the bars might be. He thought about Rebecca, who had never met a person in trouble she wouldn't try to help. And he thought about the kind of man he wanted Emma to remember her father being. No, he said simply. They can't all be bought. Something in Vasira's expression shifted, as if she'd been holding her breath and could finally exhale. "What are you going to do?" "First, I'm going to make some coffee. Then I'm going to call my lawyer, and yeah, I actually do have one, courtesy of Rebecca's estate. And then you and I are going to figure out what you really want, not what your father thinks you should want. Ulrich, you don't understand. He's not just rich, he's powerful in ways that can make your life very difficult. He could have the health department shut down your favorite restaurant, have the IRS audit your taxes going back a decade, have the city find violations in your house that require expensive fixes, maybe." Ulrich was already filling the coffee pot with water. "But he's also operating in my world now, not his. And in my world, a man's word still means something. A handshake still seals a deal. And when someone asks for help, you don't check their credit score first." Outside, one of the black SUVs started its engine and pulled away, but the other two remained. Through the kitchen window, Ulrich could see more vehicles arriving, news vans from stations he recognized, and a few he didn't. "And now we have company," he said. Vasira looked out the window and groaned. "The media. Someone must have recognized the Karaith security vehicles." She turned to him, her expression stricken. "Ulrich, I'm so sorry. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid." But Ulrich was thinking about something else entirely. The arrival of the media changed the game completely. Malvin Karaith might be willing to pressure a working-class veteran in private, but he'd be much more careful about how that pressure was applied if cameras were rolling. "Actually," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "this might be the best thing that could have happened." "How do you figure?" "Because now we're not having a private conversation anymore. Now we're having a public one." He handed her a fresh cup of coffee. "And something tells me that makes all the difference in the world. Outside, the circus was just beginning. But inside the little house on Elm Street, two people were discovering that sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't money or influence or security teams. Sometimes it's just the simple determination to do what's right, regardless of the cost." The coffee shop on Main Street had seen better decades. The Bluebird Cafe occupied a corner building that had housed everything from a haberdashery to a hardware store over its 90-year history, and the current incarnation bore the comfortable shabbiness of a place that valued function over form. Mismatched chairs surrounded tables that wobbled slightly, and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. Most importantly for Ulrich's current purposes, it had a back entrance and an owner who valued his customers. Privacy over media attention. George Castro had been running the Bluebird for 15 years, ever since he'd retired from his job as a mechanical engineer at the steel mill. When Ulrich called and asked if he could use the back room for a private conversation, George had simply said, "Doors unlocked, coffee's hot, and I don't see nothin' I don't need to see." Now, 3 hours after the media circus had begun outside Ulrich's house, he sat across from Vasira in the cafe's cramped back room, nursing his third cup of coffee and trying to process everything. She'd told him about her life as Malvin Karaith's daughter and heir. "The first time I tried to disappear, I was 22, Vasira was saying, her hands wrapped around a mug as if trying to absorb its warmth. Fresh out of Harvard Business School, ready to take on the world. I lasted exactly 6 hours before security found me at a youth hostel in Boston, trying to figure out how to backpack through Europe like a normal college graduate. What happened? My father explained very patiently that my personal desires were secondary to my responsibilities, that thousands of employees depended on Karaith Industries, and therefore on me, that I had been born into a position of trust that I couldn't simply abandon because I wanted to find myself. She made air quotes around the phrase, her voice taking on the slightly mocking tone people use when repeating criticism they've internalized. Ulrich studied her face. Even in the cafe's dim lighting, he could see the exhaustion there, not the tiredness that came from lack of sleep, but the deeper weariness of someone who had been fighting the same battle for years without winning. How many times have you tried to leave? This was the 7th. Each time, I've gotten a little farther, stayed away a little longer. I think I'm getting better at it. She attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Though clearly not good enough. What made this time different? Vasira was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if the answer might be floating there. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. 3 weeks ago, my father had a heart attack. Mild one, the doctors said, but it was a warning. He's 68 and has been working 18-hour days for 40 years. The board started making noises about succession planning, about the need for a smooth transition of power. And you realized you were about to be locked into this forever. Exactly. Not just as his daughter, but as his replacement. CEO of a company I've never wanted to run, making decisions that affect hundreds of thousands of people, living my life in boardrooms and charity galas and carefully orchestrated public appearances. She looked up at him. Do you know what it's like to have your every move planned out for you from the moment you wake up until the moment you go to sleep? Ulrich thought about his own life, the freedom to decide whether to work overtime, to choose what to have for dinner, to spend Saturday afternoon reading a book or working in his garden. Simple freedoms that Vasira apparently hadn't known since childhood. The night before I left, there was a gala, she continued. Another fundraiser, another speech about corporate responsibility and giving back to the community. I stood at the podium, looking out at a room full of people who were there because they wanted something from my father or from me. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time someone had talked to me just because they enjoyed my company. Is that why you were at the gas station? Just trying to be normal for a while? I'd been driving for 3 days, paying cash for everything, staying in small towns where no one would recognize me. I was heading for Canada, actually. Thought maybe I could get lost in Montreal for a few months, figure out who I was when I wasn't being Malvin Caraith's daughter. She laughed bitterly. Stupid, right? Like I could ever really get away from it. Not stupid, Ulrich said firmly. Human. Something in his tone made her look up sharply. You don't think I'm just a spoiled rich girl throwing a tantrum? I think you're someone who's been told what to want for so long that you forgot you had the right to want anything different. He leaned back in his chair, studying her face. The question is, what do you actually want now? I want to matter for something other than my bank account. I want to have a conversation with someone who isn't calculating what they can get from me. I want to make decisions based on what I think is right, not what's best for shareholder value. She paused. And I want to not be afraid all the time. Afraid of what? Of becoming him. Of turning into someone who sees people as assets instead of human beings, who measures success by stock prices instead of lives improved. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Of waking up one day and realizing, I've spent my entire life living someone else's dream. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the distant murmur of conversation from the main cafe and the occasional car passing on Main Street. Through the small window, Ulrich could see that the media attention had found them. A news van was parked across the street. Its satellite dish extended skyward like a mechanical flower seeking signal instead of sunlight. There's something else, Vasira said finally. Something I haven't told you about last night. Ulrich waited. Those men who tried to take me, they weren't random kidnappers. They were hired. By who? I don't know for certain. But 3 months ago, there was a hostile takeover attempt. A consortium of investors trying to acquire enough stock to force my father out. It failed, but barely. And one of the things they said in their filings was that the company would be more vulnerable after the succession, that I was an untested leader who could be easily manipulated. The implication hit Ulrich like a cold slap. You think someone was trying to kidnap you to destabilize your father's position, or to send a message about how vulnerable I am without proper security. Either way, it means that disappearing isn't just about my personal freedom anymore. It's about corporate warfare at a level where people get hurt. She looked directly at him. Including you, if you keep helping me. Ulrich considered this. The idea that he'd stumbled into the middle of a multi-billion-dollar power struggle was surreal enough to feel like something out of a movie. But the fear in Vazira's eyes was real, and so was the bruise on her cheek from the night before. "What are you going to do?" "Go back. There's no other choice now. I can't keep putting innocent people at risk, just because I want something I can never have." "And what's that?" "A normal life. A chance to figure out who I am when I'm not being Malvin Karaith's heir apparent." She stood up, her movements decisive despite the sadness in her voice. "I should call Marcus. Tell him I'm ready to come home." But as she reached for her phone, Oryx's hand closed gently over hers. "Maybe there's another option." "Like what?" "Like fighting back. Not by running away, but by taking control on your own terms." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "You said you want to matter for something other than your money. What if we made that happen?" "Oryx, you don't understand the forces we'd be up against." "No, I don't. But I understand something you might have forgotten." He stood up, his presence filling the small room with quiet confidence. "I understand what it means to fight for something that matters. And I understand that sometimes the best way to win a war isn't to run from the battlefield. It's to choose the ground where you want to make your stand." Vazira stared at him, hope and fear warring in her expression. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time." Malvin Karaith's daughter stopped trying to disappear and started making some noise of her own. He smiled, and for the first time since Rebecca's death, it felt like the smile of a man ready to change the world. "And I'm suggesting that she doesn't have to do it alone." Outside, the media circus continued to grow. But inside the back room of the Bluebird Cafe, two people were beginning to plan something that would turn the corporate world upside down and prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon against money and influence is simply the determination to do what's right, regardless of the cost. The real fight was just beginning. Abandoned Riverside Community Center sat on the edge of Millstone Valley like a monument to better times. Built in the 1960s when the steel industry was booming and civic pride ran high, it had once housed everything from youth basketball leagues to senior citizens bingo nights. Now, 3 years after budget cuts had forced its closure, it stood empty behind a chain-link fence, its windows dark and its parking lot cracked with weeds. Oryx pulled his truck up to the fence and killed the engine. Beside him, Vazira stared at the building with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. "This is your big plan? An abandoned community center?" "Not abandoned," Oryx said, climbing out of the truck. "Just waiting for the right purpose." They'd driven here directly from the Bluebird Cafe, taking back roads to avoid the media circus that had set up camp outside Oryx's house. For the past hour, he'd been explaining his idea, sketching it out in broad strokes while Vazira listened with growing interest and mounting skepticism. "Walk me through it again," she said as they approached the building. "Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like you're asking me to start a non-profit organization in a town where the biggest employer is about to lay off half its workforce." "That's exactly what I'm asking you to do." Oryx had gotten the key from Bob Martinez, who served on the city council and had been looking for creative solutions to the community center problem for months. The front door opened with a screech of hinges that hadn't been oiled in years, revealing a space that was larger and more promising than its exterior suggested. The main hall stretched out before them, its hardwood floors scarred but solid, its high ceiling supported by exposed beams that spoke of quality craftsmanship. Natural light streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like possibilities waiting to be realized. "The steel mill's in trouble," Oryx said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "Has been for 2 years, ever since the new environmental regulations went into effect. They're hemorrhaging money trying to upgrade their equipment, and word is they'll have to cut production by at least 40% over the next 18 months. Vazira walked to the center of the room, turning slowly to take in the full space. "How many jobs?" 300, maybe 400. In a town of 8,000 people, Auric joined her in the middle of the room. Most of these folks, they've worked at the mill their whole lives. Their fathers worked there, their grandfathers worked there. When the layoffs come, they won't just lose their paychecks, they'll lose their identity. And you think I can fix that with a nonprofit? I think you can give them something your father's world never bothered to provide a bridge to. Whatever comes next. He walked over to one of the side rooms, gesturing for her to follow. This could be a retraining center. Teach people new skills, help them transition to different careers. Not just job placement, but real education. Computer skills, renewable energy technology, small business development. The Zero was beginning to see the vision. The mill workers aren't the only ones who'll be affected. When you lose 400 good-paying jobs in a town this size, every business suffers. The restaurants, the shops, the service companies. Exactly. But what if instead of watching the community collapse, we helped it reinvent itself? Auric's voice carried the enthusiasm of someone who had found a cause worth fighting for. What if we turned Millstone Valley into a model for how communities can adapt and thrive instead of just survive? They spent the next hour walking through the building, Auric pointing out possibilities in every room. The old gymnasium could house equipment for training programs. The kitchen could serve not just the center, but also function as a commercial space where people could start food-based businesses. The smaller meeting rooms could become offices for new entrepreneurs or co-working, spaces for remote workers. It's ambitious, Vazira said finally. And expensive. This kind of comprehensive community development program would cost millions to launch, and millions more to sustain. Money you have. Money my father controls. And even if I could access it, what makes you think he'd approve of this? Malvin Carraith didn't become a billionaire by giving it away to help steelworkers in small Pennsylvania towns. Auric stopped walking and turned to face her. What if it wasn't charity? What if it was business? Meaning? Meaning Carraith Industries has interests in renewable energy, right? Solar, wind, battery technology? When she nodded, he continued. What if this wasn't just a retraining center, but a research and development facility? A place where your company could test new technologies while simultaneously creating jobs for displaced workers. Vasira's eyes widened as the implications hit her. A pilot program for sustainable community development. We could study the economic and social impacts, create a replicable model, maybe even license it to other communities facing similar transitions. And suddenly you're not just Malvin Carraith's daughter writing checks to make herself feel better. You're a business leader pioneering innovative solutions to real problems. For the first time since he'd known her, Vasira looked genuinely excited. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of the space, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. The board would have to approve any major new initiative, she said, more to herself than to him. But if I presented it as a strategic investment in emerging markets rather than philanthropy, if I had solid projections and a clear path to profitability, they might go for it, especially if the pilot program was small enough to limit their risk, but visible enough to generate positive publicity. And if it succeeded here, we could expand to other communities, other industries. Create a whole division focused on sustainable economic development. She stopped taking pictures and looked at him. You've been thinking about this for a while, haven't you? Ever since I heard your father's message this morning. He kept talking about your responsibilities, about how many people depend on Carraith Industries. But what if instead of seeing that as a burden, you saw it as an opportunity? To actually help people instead of just generating shareholder value. To prove that business, success and community benefit don't have to be mutually exclusive. Vasira was quiet for a long moment, staring at the empty hall as if she could already see it filled with people learning new skills, starting new businesses, building new lives. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful but determined. There would be conditions. My father would want oversight, regular reporting, clear metrics for success. And if it failed, I'd be risking my credibility within the company, maybe even my position as heir. And if it succeeded? If it succeeded, I'd have proven that I can lead Karaith Industries in a direction that creates value beyond just profit margins. I'd have earned the respect of the board on my own terms, not just inherited it. She turned to face him, her expression more alive than he'd seen it since they met. You're not just offering me a way to help this community, are you? You're offering me a way to become the kind of leader I actually want to be. I'm offering you a chance to matter for all the right reasons, Oryx said simply. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. But inside the abandoned community center, two people were beginning to build something that could change not just Millstone Valley, but the very definition of corporate responsibility. The question now was whether the rest of the world was ready for what they were planning. The first attack came at dawn, delivered not by hired kidnappers, but by the more civilized violence of financial pressure. Vasira's phone buzzed with an incoming call just as she was finishing her second cup of coffee in Oryx's kitchen, watching through the window as news crews set up their equipment on the street outside. Ms. Halcourt? The voice was crisp, professional, and completely unfamiliar. This is Jennifer Walsh from First National Bank. I'm calling regarding the status of your personal accounts. Vasira felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning air. What about them? I'm afraid we've received instructions to freeze all transactions, pending a review of some irregularities. The review should be completed within 7 to 10 business days. Assuming no complications arise, the message was clear. Her father had cut off her access to her own money. Without funds, she couldn't implement any grand plans for community development or anything else. She was effectively trapped, dependent on his goodwill for everything from hotel rooms to meals. I see, she said carefully. And who authorized this review? I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, but I can tell you that all appropriate legal procedures are being followed. Have a good day, Ms. Halcourt. The line went dead. Vasira stared at her phone, feeling the walls of her gilded cage closing in once again. Across the kitchen, Oryx was reading something on his laptop, his expression growing darker with each line. More good news? She asked. Depends on your definition. He turned the laptop screen toward her. The headline of the online article read, Steel Mill Worker Kidnaps Billionaire Heiress. Romance or ransom? The article was a masterpiece of innuendo and selective quotation. It painted Oryx as an opportunistic fortune hunter who had somehow manipulated Vasira into staying with him despite her family's attempts to rescue her. Anonymous sources suggested that he might have been involved in the original kidnapping attempt, positioning himself as a hero to gain her trust. The piece even included quotes from unnamed Karaith Industries executives expressing concern about stockholder confidence if news of the relationship continued to spread. They're trying to destroy your reputation, Vasira said, scrolling through the article with growing horror. That's not the worst part. Oryx clicked to another tab, revealing a different news site. This headline read, Thornfield Steel announces accelerated layoff timeline. The article was brief but devastating. Due to unforeseen market pressures, the steel mill would be implementing its planned workforce reduction immediately rather than over the next 18 months. 347 workers would receive termination notices by the end of the week. The company deeply regretted the necessity but cited the need to remain competitive in challenging economic conditions. This is my father's doing, Vasira said, her voice tight with anger. He's punishing the whole community because I won't come home quietly. Can he do that? Just destroy people's livelihoods to make a point? Karaith Industries has investments in the fund that holds Thornfield's debt. A phone call suggesting they accelerate their restructuring demands, maybe a hint that their continued financing might be at risk if they don't act decisively. She set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. He's done this before. just never somewhere I could see the human cost up close. The phone in the kitchen rang. Ulrich answered it, his jaw tightening as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "I understand," he said finally. "Thanks for letting me know." "Thanks for letting me know." He hung up and turned to face her, his expression grim. "That was my supervisor at the mill. I've been suspended pending an investigation into possible conflicts of interest and inappropriate conduct. Apparently, someone raised concerns about my relationship with a major stakeholder in the company's financing structure. They fired you. Suspended." But yeah, probably amounts to the same thing. The full scope of her father's strategy was becoming clear. Isolate Vasira financially, destroy Ulrich's credibility and livelihood, and demonstrate to the entire community what happened to anyone who got between Malvin Karaith and his daughter. It was ruthlessly efficient and completely legal. "I should go," Vasira said, standing abruptly. "This was insane from the beginning. I can't let him destroy your life just because I was stupid enough to think I could change mine. Sit down." Something in Ulrich's tone stopped her mid-step. When she looked at him, she saw not defeat but determination, the same expression he'd worn when facing down the kidnappers 2 nights earlier. "I said sit down." She sat. "Your father thinks he knows what he's dealing with," Ulrich said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "He thinks I'm just another person he can buy or break or intimidate into doing what he wants. But he's made one critical mistake, which is, he's fighting this battle like a corporate takeover, all financial pressure and reputation management. But this isn't a boardroom, and I'm not a business competitor." Ulrich stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the news crews and protesters who had gathered on his street. Some held signs supporting Vasira's right to make her own choices. Others demanded that she stop bringing trouble to their community. The division was exactly what her father had intended. "In Afghanistan, we called this a hearts and minds campaign," he said. "You win by making people believe in what you're fighting for, not by forcing them to submit to what you want." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your father is playing chess while we should be playing poker." He turned back to her, that slow smile spreading across his face again. "And I'm saying it's time to call his bluff." Before Vasira could ask what he meant, there was a knock at the front door. Not the aggressive pounding of security personnel, but the polite, measured knock of someone who understood they were asking permission rather than demanding entry. Ulrich opened the door to find a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed but with the slightly windblown look of someone who had been standing outside for a while. Behind her stood a camera crew, but they remained on the sidewalk, clearly under instructions to wait. "Mr. Van Roe? I'm Catherine Morrison from Channel 8 News. I was wondering if you and Ms. Halcourt might be willing to give an interview about your side of the story." Ulrich glanced back at Vasira, who was shaking her head emphatically. The last thing she wanted was more media attention. But Ulrich was thinking about something else entirely, about the difference between reacting to attacks and taking control of the narrative. "Actually," he said to the reporter, "I think we might have something to say after all." The interview that followed would be replayed on news channels across the country for weeks. Not because of any scandal or revelation, but because of what happened when 2 people decided to stop being victims of someone else's story and started telling their own. But first, they had to survive the firestorm that was about to engulf Millstone Valley. The interview took place on Ulrich's front porch, with Millstone Valley's modest downtown visible in the background and the autumn leaves of Elm Street providing a backdrop that suggested stability and American values. Catherine Morrison had agreed to let them speak uninterrupted for the first 10 minutes, understanding instinctively that the real story here wasn't scandal, but something much more compelling. Vasira sat beside Ulrich on the porch swing he'd built with his own hands 5 years earlier, wearing one of Rebecca's sweaters and looking more relaxed than she had since arriving in town. For the first time in her adult life, she was about to speak publicly without a script, without handlers, and without her father's approval. "Let's start with you," Ms. Halcourt, Morrison said as the cameras rolled. Why are you here in Millstone Valley instead of at your family's estate in Connecticut? Because for the first time in my life, I'm somewhere I'm wanted for who I am rather than what I'm worth, Vasira replied simply. 3 nights ago, Oryx saved my life. Not because he knew who I was, but because it was the right thing to do. That kind of genuine human decency is something I'd almost forgotten existed. And Mr. Van Roe, what do you say to critics who suggest you're taking advantage of Miss Halcourt's vulnerability for personal gain? Oryx's response was measured but firm. I'd say they don't understand what we're actually trying to accomplish here. This isn't about romance or money or taking advantage of anyone. It's about proving that business success and community benefit don't have to be enemies. He gestured toward the downtown area visible behind them. In 6 months, this community is going to lose 400 good-paying jobs when the steel mill completes its downsizing. Families that have lived here for generations are going to have to choose between leaving everything they've ever known or watching their standard of living collapse. But instead of seeing that as an inevitable tragedy, Vasira continued, picking up his thread seamlessly, we see it as an opportunity to pioneer a new model of economic development, one that helps communities transition to sustainable industries while creating value for investors. Morrison leaned forward, clearly intrigued. Can you be more specific about what that would look like? For the next 20 minutes, Vasira outlined their vision for the Millstone Valley Sustainable Development Initiative with the kind of detailed knowledge and passionate conviction that surprised even Oryx. She spoke about retraining programs that would transition steelworkers into renewable energy technicians, about turning the old community center into a research facility where Karaith Industries could develop and test new technologies, while providing employment for displaced workers. But more than the specific programs, what came across was her genuine commitment to the people affected. She knew their names, their stories, their concerns about the future. In just 3 days, she had connected with this community in a way that years of charity galas and corporate philanthropy had never achieved. This sounds like an expensive undertaking, Morrison observed. How do you plan to fund it? By proving that social responsibility can be profitable, Vasira said. If we can demonstrate that this model works in Millstone Valley, we can license it to other communities facing similar transitions. What starts as an investment in one small Pennsylvania town could become a new industry sector. Oryx watched her speak and felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't the defeated woman who had been ready to give up her freedom just that morning. This was someone who had found her purpose, who had discovered what she was meant to fight for. Mr. Van Roe, Morrison said, turning to him, you've been suspended from your job at the steel mill. Some are saying that's retaliation for your relationship with Ms. Halcourt. How do you respond? I respond by pointing out that retaliation only works if you're afraid of the consequences, Oryx said. But the truth is, I've been looking for a way to serve this community beyond just showing up for my shift every day. If this situation gives me the chance to help build something better for all of us, then losing my old job might be the best thing that ever happened to me. He reached over and took Vasira's hand, the gesture simple but unmistakably supportive. Besides, I've learned something important this week. Sometimes the most valuable things in life come disguised as problems. Are you talking about your relationship with Ms. Halcourt? I'm talking about the chance to stand up for something that matters, even when powerful people would prefer you to sit down and be quiet. The interview continued for another 15 minutes, but those were the words that would be quoted in newspapers and repeated on talk shows across the country. Two people from completely different worlds, choosing to stand together against pressure that would have crushed either of them. A lone dot when the cameras finally stopped rolling. Morrison thanked them both and packed up her equipment. But as her crew loaded their van, she pulled Oryx aside. Off the record, she said, I've been covering corporate stories for 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. If you two can actually pull this off, it could change how people think about business responsibility. And if we can't? Morrison glanced toward the house where Vazira was visible through the kitchen window, already on her laptop working on implementation details for their proposal. Then at least you'll have tried something worth failing at that evening. As the news crews departed and the protesters gradually dispersed, Auric and Vazira sat on the porch swing watching the sun set behind the mountains. The first responses to the interview were already appearing on social media, and the initial reaction was cautiously positive. "Your father's going to be furious," Auric observed. "Furious," Auric observed. "Probably. But he's also going to be curious. The board will want to know more about this sustainable development idea, especially if it's getting positive media coverage." Vazira leaned against his shoulder, feeling more relaxed than she had in years. "He may hate how we got here, but he's too good a businessman to ignore a potentially profitable venture. And if he tries to shut it down anyway, then we find other investors. There are plenty of impact investment funds that would be interested in a project like this, especially with the publicity we're generating." Auric was quiet for a moment, processing the reality of what they'd committed to. 24 hours earlier, he'd been a suspended steel mill worker with no clear path forward. Now he was planning to transform an entire community's economic future, alongside one of the richest women in America. "Are we completely insane?" he asked. Vazira considered the question seriously. "Probably. But we're insane together, which makes it feel more like courage." The phone inside the house started ringing, as it had been doing all afternoon. Reporters wanting follow-up interviews, community members offering support or expressing concern, and probably Malvin Karaith demanding explanations for his daughter's very public defiance, but neither of them moved to answer it. For now, it was enough to sit together in the gathering darkness, watching the lights come on in the windows of Millstone Valley and planning for a future that neither of them could have imagined a week ago. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures, and new opportunities to prove that love and principle could triumph over money and power. But tonight, on the front porch of a modest house on Elm Street, two people had chosen each other and a cause worth fighting for. The real work was about to begin. 6 weeks after the interview that changed everything, the old Riverside Community Center buzzed with an energy it hadn't seen in years. Where empty hallways had once echoed with silence, voices now filled every room as contractors worked alongside volunteers to transform the abandoned building into something unprecedented. Vazira stood in what would soon become the main training facility, watching as Jim Patterson, a 20-year veteran of the steel mill, practiced welding techniques on equipment that would be used for wind turbine maintenance. His movements were careful, deliberate, guided by Maria Santos, who had transitioned from police officer to renewable energy instructor after completing the certification program that Vazira had funded. "Personally, the muscle memory is still there," Jim said, pulling off his welding mask to examine his work. "Just have to learn to think about it differently. Steel is steel, whether you're building I-beams or turbine towers." 3 months earlier, Jim had been one of the workers facing immediate layoff when the mill accelerated its downsizing timeline. Now he was 2 weeks away from completing his certification as a wind energy technician, with a job already waiting for him at a wind farm being constructed 50 miles north of Millstone Valley. "How many people have completed the program so far?" Vazira asked Maria as they walked toward the newly renovated offices. 37 in renewable energy, 22 in advanced manufacturing, 15 in small business development. Maria consulted the tablet she carried everywhere now, her role as program coordinator keeping her constantly busy. "And we have a waiting list of over 200 people, not just from Millstone Valley, but from communities as far as West Virginia." The numbers represented more than statistics to Vazira. They were families who wouldn't have to choose between staying in their hometown and finding work. They were people who had discovered skills they didn't know they possessed and confidence they thought they'd lost. forever. In the business development wing, she found Auric working with Sarah Chun, a former mill administrative assistant who was launching a catering company focused on locally sourced foods. Sarah's business plan spread across the conference table they'd built from reclaimed mill equipment, her projections showing potential contracts with the community center, local businesses, and eventually the regional school district. The farm-to-table movement isn't just for big cities, Sarah was explaining to the small group of aspiring entrepreneurs gathered around the table. Rural communities can create sustainable food networks that keep money local and provide better nutrition for families. Auric looked up as Vazira entered, his face lighting with the kind of smile that had become automatic over the past month and a half. Since leaving the steel mill, he had thrown himself into the community development project with an energy that surprised even him. As operations manager for what was now officially called the Millstone Valley Sustainable Development Initiative, he was part counselor, part project manager, and part evangelist for the idea that economic transition could be an opportunity rather than a disaster. "How did the board meeting go?" he asked quietly, joining her near the window that overlooked the bustling main hall. "Better than I expected." Vasira's voice carried a note of cautious optimism. The preliminary results impressed them. A 93% job placement rate for program graduates, positive media coverage that's actually boosting Karaith's stock price, and enough interest from other communities that they're willing to consider expansion. The Karaith Industries Board meeting had been her first real test as a corporate leader operating on her own terms. Instead of sitting quietly while others discussed her future, she had presented 18 months of detailed projections, complete with risk assessments and scalability studies for what could become a new division of the company. "Your father?" "Still not speaking to me directly, but he's not actively sabotaging the project anymore either. I think he's realized that fighting me publicly was only making him look like a tyrant." She paused. "Besides, the profit projections are too good to ignore. Even if he doesn't like how we got here." Through the window, they could see the economic impact spreading throughout Millstone Valley. New businesses had opened to serve the influx of students and instructors. Property values had stabilized as young families stopped leaving for opportunities elsewhere. The downtown area, which had been slowly dying for a decade, now showed signs of genuine revitalization. "There's something else," Vazira said, pulling an envelope from her briefcase. "I got approval to purchase the community center outright, along with the old Miller warehouse and the vacant lot behind the post office. We're expanding." Auric stared at the document she handed him, trying to process the implications. What had started as a desperate attempt to save one small community was becoming something much larger, a proof of concept that was attracting attention from economists, politicians, and business leaders across the country. "The sustainable development model is being studied by 3 universities now," Vasira continued. "We've got delegations coming from communities in Ohio, Kentucky, and North Carolina to see how they might implement similar programs. And the Department of Commerce wants to discuss making this a national pilot program." But what struck Auric most wasn't the scope of their success, but the change in Vazira herself. The defeated woman who had been ready to surrender her dreams 6 weeks earlier had been replaced by someone who radiated confidence and purpose. She spoke to corporate executives with the same genuine warmth she showed to displaced steelworkers. She understood balance sheets and cash flow projections, as well as she understood the human cost of economic disruption. "You've found it, haven't you?" he said. "What you were looking for when you tried to disappear all those times." "I found something better," she replied, watching as a group of program graduates gathered for a celebration in the main hall. "I found out who I was meant to become." As evening approached and the center gradually quieted, Auric and Vazira walked through the building they had transformed together, checking on final details and discussing plans for the next phase of development. But more than evaluating their professional success, they were savoring the simple pleasure of building something meaningful with their own hands and hearts. Outside, Millstone Valley settled into another evening of cautious optimism, its future no longer dependent on the decisions of distant corporate executives, but shaped by the determination of its own people to create something better. And inside the community center, that had become a symbol of what was possible when vision met opportunity, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances were discovering that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with the smallest acts of courage. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation had been built to last. 2.5 years after a chance encounter at a gas station changed everything. Vazira Halcourt Van Roe stood at the podium in the main auditorium of what was now known as the Kidnapping Center for Sustainable Community Development. The space could seat 300 people, and every chair was filled with community leaders, government officials, academics, and journalists who had come to witness the official launch of the National Sustainable Transition Initiative. But as she looked out at the audience, Vazira's attention was drawn to the front row, where Emma Van Roe sat beside her new stepfather's parents, beaming with the kind of pride that only a 15-year-old could muster when watching her family change the world. Emma had been 12 when Vazira first entered their lives, suspicious and protective of her father's heart. Now she was Vazira's most enthusiastic champion, having written her sophomore English essay on how my stepmom saved our town and taught me that business can be a force for good. 3 years ago, Vazira began, her voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium. I was a woman who had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. I was running from a life that felt like a prison, from responsibilities that seemed designed to diminish rather than elevate the human spirit. In the third row, she could see her father, Malvin Karaith, listening with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for quarterly earnings reports. Their relationship had evolved slowly, moving from open hostility through grudging respect to something approaching genuine partnership. He still didn't understand why she had chosen love over luxury, community over corporate advancement, but he could no longer argue with the results. Today, the Millstone Valley model has been implemented in 47 communities across 12 states. We've retrained over 8,000 workers, helped launch more than 1,500 new businesses, and proven that economic transition doesn't have to mean economic devastation. The statistics were impressive, but they barely captured the human impact of what had grown from Orrick's simple belief that communities could reinvent themselves if given the right support. In the audience, she could see faces that represented individual success stories. Maria Santos, now the regional coordinator for law enforcement transition programs. Jim Patterson, whose welding skills had evolved into a supervisory role at the largest wind farm in Pennsylvania. Sarah Chun, whose catering business had grown into a regional food service company, employing 63 people. But the real measure of our success isn't in the numbers, Vazira continued. It's in the transformation of what we believe is possible when business serves community, rather than the other way around. She paused, letting her gaze find Orrick, who was standing near the back of the auditorium in his role as executive director of operations. Even after 2.5 years of marriage, he still insisted on being the man who made sure every detail was perfect, rather than the one who took credit for the vision. But Vazira had learned to read the quiet pride in his eyes, the satisfaction of someone who had found his true calling in service to others. Karaith Industries Board of Directors voted last month to establish the Sustainable Community Development Division as a permanent part of our corporate structure, with projected revenues of $200 million annually by 2028. What began as an experiment in one small Pennsylvania town has become a new industry sector, proving that social responsibility and profitability are not just compatible, but mutually reinforcing. In the government section, she recognized Senator Patricia Holbrook, who had championed legislation providing tax incentives for companies implementing sustainable transition programs. The political support had been crucial in scaling their model, but it had taken concrete results to convince skeptical, lawmakers that this wasn't just feel-good philanthropy, but hard-headed economic development. However, I want to be clear about something, Vazira said, her tone becoming more personal. None of this would have been possible without the courage of ordinary people who refused to accept that decline was inevitable, that communities were expendable, that working people didn't deserve a voice in their own economic future. She gestured toward a section where current program participants sat, men and women in the middle of career transitions, learning new skills and discovering capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. Their presence reminded everyone in the auditorium that this wasn't a celebration of past achievement but a commitment to ongoing work. Most importantly, it wouldn't have been possible without the man who taught me that real leadership isn't about having power over others, but about empowering others to discover their own strength. Oryx's face reddened slightly at the attention, but he didn't look away. Their partnership had deepened over the years, evolving from the initial attraction of opposites into something more substantial, a shared commitment to principles that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. Oryx Van Rowe could have walked away from a dangerous situation 3 years ago. He could have minded his own business when he saw someone in trouble. Instead, he made a choice that changed not just my life, but the trajectory of sustainable development policy across the United States. The applause was sustained and genuine, but Vazira raised her hand to continue. That choice reminds us that transformation begins with individual courage. It begins with people who see problems and decide to become part of the solution, who recognize that their own well-being is connected to the well-being of their community. In the family section, Emma was recording everything on her phone, probably for a social media post that would reach her generation with the message that business leadership could be about more than personal enrichment. At 15, she was already talking about studying sustainable business practices, inspired by watching her stepmother prove that corporate success and social impact could go hand in hand. The National Sustainable Transition Initiative represents our commitment to taking this model nationwide, but with a crucial difference. We're not imposing solutions from outside communities, we're providing resources and support for solutions that emerge from within communities. Because lasting change has to come from people who understand their own challenges and their own strengths. As she neared the end of her remarks, Vazira felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a business launch or a policy announcement, it was the culmination of a journey that had transformed her from a reluctant heiress into someone who had found her own definition of success. 3 years ago, I thought freedom meant escaping responsibility. I've learned that true freedom comes from choosing responsibilities that align with your values, from building something bigger than yourself while staying true to who you are. She looked directly at Oryx, her voice carrying across the auditorium but feeling intimate despite the crowd. I've learned that love isn't about finding someone who completes you, but about finding someone who inspires you to become the person you were meant to be. And I've learned that the most powerful business plan in the world is simply this: see people as human beings worthy of dignity and opportunity, and then organize everything else around that fundamental truth. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, but what Vazira would remember most was the moment afterward, when Emma bounded onto the stage and wrapped her in a hug that felt like acceptance, like family, like home. Later that evening, as the official reception wound down and the last of the dignitaries departed, Vazira and Oryx found themselves alone in the community center that had started it all. The building hummed with quiet activity night classes in computer programming, a support group for entrepreneurs, teenagers working on a robotics project that combined engineering skills with environmental sustainability. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you just driven past that gas station? Vazira asked, settling into the chair behind what was now Oryx's desk. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I remember what Rebecca used to say, that we don't get to know what might have been, only what is and what we choose to do about it. Through the windows, they could see Millstone Valley settling into another evening of cautious optimism, transformed into genuine prosperity. The downtown area glowed with the lights of thriving businesses. Young families pushed strollers along sidewalks that had been empty just 3 years earlier. The future that had once seemed so precarious now felt full of possibility. "We built something good here," Vazira said softly. "We built something that lasts," Auric corrected. "And something that grows." Outside, the world continued its complicated dance of progress and setback, hope and disappointment. But inside the community center where it all began, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances had proven that sometimes the most extraordinary changes begin with the simplest decision to help a stranger in need. Story that had started with 3 words shouted across a moonlit parking lot, "Don't move," had become a movement that would touch hundreds of thousands of lives. And it all began with one person who refused to walk away when someone needed help, and another person who refused to give up on the possibility that her life could matter for all the right reasons. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.